Give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses, the poem goes. Today, many new immigrants to the U.S. are still poor and tired, but they're certainly not sick. In fact, they may be healthier than the rest of us.
They're doing something right. We have to understand what it is and try to spread that benefit to a larger segment of society. That's the lesson that immigrants teach us in public health.
But the good health many immigrants arrive with comes with an expiration date. Instead of improving their health, life in the U.S. often has the opposite effect. Within a generation, they see their health advantages undermined by the same social forces that erode the health of all of us.
As these new Americans become more like old Americans, they get unhealthy.
Amador Bernal arrived in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, from his native Mexico to work in the mushroom farms. He was 21 years old. 40 miles south of Philadelphia, Kennett Square claims the title Mushroom Capital of the World. Mexicans have been migrating here to work since the 1970s. They make up almost 1/4 of the town's population. Amador Bernal works at Kale and Mushroom Farms, one of the biggest.
Yo nada más me dedico a regar el hongo, a echarle agua con una manguera y una regaderita. Entonces yo solo se termina muy temprano, me pongo a ayudarles por ahí en algo a los demás. O sea, yo gano $9.03 por hora. Trabajo 8 horas al día, los 7 días de la semana.
In almost 25 years in the U.S., Amador Bernal has never once been to a doctor, and he's not the exception.
I sat in on this meeting, and I remember the generalizations. You know, they're always late for their appointments, they're always dirty, and they all have infectious diseases. And I thought to myself, having worked now for several years with the Mexican population, boy, where were they getting these generalizations from?
In the early 1990s, Steve Larson worked as a doctor with the Kennett Square Mexican community.
And I had several thousand patients I would see, so I had the data crunched. And I pulled it out in this meeting, and I said, well, you're actually quite wrong. These are young, healthy people, for the most part. They're not here to drain the system. So, that's a myth.
Health data gathered by researchers going door to door in Alameda County, California, mirror what Larson saw in Kennett Square.
One of the things that the data told us in our health department was that immigrant Latinos had the best health of anybody in the county by far. They had the lowest rates of death, lowest rates of heart disease, lowest rates of all the major killers. And that was a startling finding to us. We couldn't understand why the poorest, most socially marginalized population actually had the best health. Better health, not just than other poor people, but better health than the wealthiest segments of our societies. We mean, that's profound.
On the other side of the country, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Dr. Margarita Alegria leads a team. Dr. Margarita Alegria leads a team looking at a similar phenomenon through the lens of mental health. In the 1960s, researchers identified what they called the Latino paradox.
They were surprised to find that Latinos that were immigrant, who had lower education, lower income, were under very stressful conditions of adaptation to the U.S., had actually lower rates of psychiatric illness than whites who were higher income, higher education. And this has also been shown in cardiovascular disease and cancer and other illnesses. It's quite a paradox.
One explanation is that Latino immigrants who come here have better health on average than those who stay behind. But researchers are also circling in on a second hypothesis.
I think the other explanation has been more about the role of very strong, cohesive family ties that hold Latino families together, even under hardship. And these very strong family ties facilitate people struggling through, disadvantageous conditions.
For 20 years, Amador Bernal traveled back and forth between Mexico and Kennett Square.
Ya trabajaba 4, 5, 6 meses, 7 meses, me iba para allá porque extrañaba mucho más que nada pues a todos, a Maritza, seguir la soñaba y todo eso.
Tenga una cada quien.
After he got his green card, Amador filed papers for his family to join him. It took 9 years to get approval. They finally arrived in the U.S. a year ago.
Para mí es mucho mejor hacer porque no estoy aparte de ellos. Los veo diario.
Amador and his wife Bernardita have lots of family in Kennett Square. They help ease the stress of settling in a new country.
Su papá de él nos ayudó para comprar la mesa. Mi papá nos dio también y compramos la televisión, compramos el microondas. Sí.
Alfredo, ¿qué onda?
Sus hermanos de ella, ellos no tienen carro, luego me dicen pues, que llévame a Walmart, los llevo, y así, una con otra. Y así resolvemos los problemas.
Immigrants bring to this country aspects of culture, of tradition, of tight family social networks and community social networks that essentially form a shield around them and allow them to withstand the deleterious, the negative impacts of American culture.
But maintaining the support networks of close family and community is becoming increasingly difficult for all Americans. We now work longer hours than any other industrialized nation, even Japan. The average American now spends 50 minutes a day commuting. 10 million of us take 2 hours or more. 1 in 4 Americans say there is no one with whom they discuss important matters. That number nearly tripled in the last 20 years. Social isolation is on the rise in the United States. And isolation can kill. That was the finding of a seminal study conducted in California in the 1970s.
It was astounding. Overall, people who are really isolated are at increased risk not only for cardiovascular disease, but for infectious diseases, for diabetes, for strokes, for cancer. They were at increased risk from almost every cause of death. Social isolation kind of metaphorically accelerates the rate of aging. The fact that you got something when you were 50 instead of 80 or 30 instead of 60 is because being socially isolated is a chronically stressful situation which just kind of leans on the body.
No, como le decía yo.
But staying socially connected in a way that protects health takes more than close family ties.
That's one of the lessons of America, that your family isn't enough, ultimately, to protect you against some of the influences of America. It really is a challenge to try to make sure that before the inevitable breakdown of these close family units occurs, that the communities are organized in ways to essentially keep that sort of protective shield alive.
The Bernals may have found some of that community support in Kennett Square itself. It's a Pennsylvania town with a Quaker sense of mission, and it does more than many communities to invest in its future with good schools, social services, and many other resources to support all its families.
I think what makes Kennett Square so unique in that regard are the different organizations that are trying to not just bridge and create a link with the immigrant population, but is also, I think, helping this population not fall into the category of being underclass.
Everyone benefits if no one is left behind. That was the idea behind Bridging the Community meetings begun by Joan Holliday in 1997.
I've, as a public health nurse, felt this community had so many resources for being such a small town, but we weren't talking to each other.
The meetings are an opportunity for residents to find out about resources available in the area and exchange services.
I'm Linda Ekman, and I've been in this community 23 years. And I'm starting a 12-step group for kids with addiction issues.
Mi nombre es Fidel Vázquez,
My name is Fidel Vasquez.
trabajador de Caulín, de Piqui, de Hongo.
I work at Kale and Mushroom, and I pick mushrooms.
If you know of anyone who wants part-time or full-time or anything, we really have a great need for a bilingual receptionist.
There are people in poverty here. There are people here with need. But I don't think it's a large population that find themselves in dire straits. Not like you would find in similar communities in other areas of the United States.
Another resource for families is the Garage, the town's youth center. After school, students come here to work with volunteers, use the computer lab, or just hang out. Alfredo Bernal often comes here to do his homework. His brother Israel practices his English with a retired executive.
Aquí se me han abierto otras puertas. Pues sí, me gustaría estudiar algo de ingeniería. Ir a Penn State, por ejemplo. Aquí, o sea, si ven que tú eres inteligente o si le echas ganas, ellos te apoyan. Mis pensamientos son de estudiar trabajador social para ayudar a las personas que, por ejemplo, vienen de México o así, a cualquier persona para ayudarlas.
Community support in Kennett Square gives Alfredo and Israel reason to be hopeful as they look ahead. And if they can climb the economic ladder, they stand a better chance of a healthy future.
In America, wealth pretty much equals health, and that's true for me as it is true for, the poorest person in the quote-unquote inner city. There's a gradient, and all the way along the way you can find yourself somewhere along that gradient. It's not like you're poor and you have bad health, and then you're not poor and you have good health. For each step along that wealth gradient, you have a corresponding step of health. When you're a new immigrant, the relationship between wealth and health is relatively loose. As you become more American, that relationship becomes tighter and tighter and tighter.
After only 5 years in the U.S., Latino immigrants are 1.5 times more likely to have high blood pressure than when they first arrived, and to be obese. Rates of heart disease and diabetes also increase. More than 20% of Latino households are poor. The longer they're here, the more immigrant families struggle with discrimination, low-paying jobs, bad schools, and bad housing.
And if that environment is giving you cues that you're not valuable, that you have very little prospect for a good future, that starts to build up. You internalize that devaluation.
1 in 4 Latino children drop out of high school. Shockingly, 1 in 7 teenage Latina girls attempt suicide.
Immigrant Latinos, as they acculturate, as the stress levels accumulate, their children start to lose that sense of why it is that they were here. They lose that connection to their parents' hopefulness. They become more American. They acquire American habits, American diets, American sensibilities. They're gaining traction in the American way of life, but they're losing that hopefulness that their immigrant parents brought with them that might actually be health protective.
Today, the Bernals are still healthy, but they're facing the same kinds of pressures and stresses many of us live with day in and day out. Bernardita Bernal packs mushrooms.
Ponemos tapas, hacemos labels, los ponemos, pesamos bolsas. Salen de 12 a 15 bolsas por minuto. Cada día trabajo 9 o 10 horas diarias. Si hay mucho humo, trabajamos los 6 días.
Bernardita earns $6.50 an hour. Like many American families, the Bernals need as many incomes as they can generate.
Mi hermano y yo trabajamos en un restaurante llamado Longwood Gardens en el dishwasher. Antes de yo empezar a trabajar ahí, trabajaba en las tardes de 4 a... no tenía hora para salir. So, había veces que salía ya bien tarde de trabajar y pues ya llegaba yo bien cansado aquí a mi casa y nada más me dormía. Entonces yo ya no hacía tareas y pues a través de eso iba bajando yo mis calificaciones y por eso preferí salirme de ahí de trabajar y trabajar nada más los fines de semana. ¿No me han hablado por teléfono?
Sí, hablaron.
¿Quién habló? ¿Quién sería de las dos? No, no es cierto.
Like half of American households, the Bernals live on about $46,000 a year. And they're trying to make ends meet in one of the most upscale counties in Pennsylvania. Even renting a small house by the train tracks is expensive. Three-fourths of their income goes to basic expenses, like rent, food, utilities, and transportation, for a family of 6.
¿Qué hay en especial? El pavo. ¿Qué hay en especial el pavo?
3 out of 4 Americans who started out at the bottom of the income ladder in the late 1980s were still there a decade later.
John, call Hunter, please come in Thursday. John.
¿Y acaso de así eche?
There's this mythology of the American dream that, anybody can move up that ladder with the right amount of gumption. Then there are certainly anecdotal stories of that, and people have good luck and good fortune. But for the most part, the overwhelming majority of people don't move up that ladder.
These economic insecurities erode the social and family ties that support our health.
Por una parte no los podemos tener todo el tiempo como mi mamá, llegando de la escuela y estaba con nosotros y todo. Y aquí pues llegamos y nomás yo estoy aquí solita, no que llega mi hermana, mi papá, y luego va a recoger a mi mamá.
One of the things that we know that immigrant parents do is that they work, and they work a lot. And so as a consequence, their children have less time with them, and less exposure to them, to those cultural aspects of family, of community, that parents inculcate in their children.
Olga and Maritza were 11 and 8 when they came to the U.S. When social and family ties begin to fray, it's the mental health of the youngest arrivals that's the most vulnerable. The risk of psychiatric disorders for Latino immigrant children depends on their age when they arrive here.
The longer you stay in your country of origin, for especially the times where you have a higher risk of developing illnesses like psychiatric disorders like anxiety or like depression, the longer you stay in your country of origin, the lower the risk you're going to have of developing those disorders. What is it in this country that suddenly increases your risk for psychiatric illness? What are we doing here?
William Vega has studied the psychological health of Mexican immigrants in California.
If nothing else, the paradox is putting the spotlight on the fact that the United States has very high levels of depression. And we found when we looked at the population that came as immigrants and had about 13 years or less in the country, they had very, very low levels of major depression, only about 8%. The general population of the United States, that would be 18 to 20% in a lifetime. But those levels increased when we looked at people who had been in the country over 13 years. See, these protective factors begin to wear down, and then subsequently over multiple generations, we can anticipate that they'll look increasingly just like the American people as a population, because they live here, they become Americans.
For immigrant mushroom workers, becoming an American is a journey filled with opportunity, challenges, and risks. A number of workers are beginning to feel the effects of newly diagnosed chronic diseases.
Familia, hay personas que tienen la diabetes. Yo tengo. Usted lo tiene. ¿Y cuándo le diagnosticaron?
Hace como 9 meses.
9 meses, muy recién, entonces.
Like almost half of America's workforce, mushroom workers get no paid sick days. Recently, 3 mushroom farms allowed La Comunidad Hispana, a social service agency in Kennett Square, to open clinics on site.
Workers don't like to take time off from work. It's money not being earned, and they really do need to earn money. So that they would not necessarily go to see anybody until symptoms are pretty bad.
Puedes levantar la camisa.
Obesity probably is the leading issue here, and along with that comes all the other problems of diabetes, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, and of course with all of that you have strokes coming down the pike, congestive heart failure. So we do screening of all of those. For whatever reason the patient comes in, that's the protocol.
Correcto. ¿Y otra vez?
By the year 2050, 1 in 4 Americans will be Latino.
If we acknowledge that this is the population that's growing, then, we have to plan for 20 years from now, 30 years from now. If well-being isn't prioritized now, then what's the landscape of our country going to look like 20, 30 years from now?
Si yo tuviera crédito, pues sí me gustaría comprar una casa, pero no tenemos nada ahorrado. Con un poco de dinero que tenga uno, entonces ya le pueden dar un obsequio más de crédito para una casita y ya lo vamos pagando poco a poco.
juveniles are hopeful about their future. But can they maintain their hope and their health as they become more American and as America becomes more a part of them?
When we talk about acculturation, the process of becoming more Americanized, it's not a process of changing cultures A to Z. It's a process of selectively taking on elements of American culture. And I think if we can bring that selection process into clear focus of which processes are selected and which are not selected and which are retained from the old culture, you have a better mix.
And this may have lessons for all of us.
As a society, we can build hope. And we do that by giving people access to those things that give them potential for success. That's good education. That's access to good jobs, decent housing, and then a sense of belonging to a community, belonging to something larger than yourself, larger than your family. The potential right now is to try to take what we can see, obviously, in new immigrant communities, the health protective benefits of being a new immigrant.